Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really wild story. How one guy's incredibly bold financial plan basically built the American economy from the ground up and, in the process, kicked off the nation's first great conflict.
So let me ask you this. How do you build a national economy completely from scratch? I mean, seriously, just imagine it. You've just won this massive revolution, but your brand new nation? It's completely broke, it's divided, and honestly, it's on the verge of collapse. That was the huge challenge facing the United States back in 1789. Yeah, they'd won the war, but what the future held, nobody knew.
$79 million. That's the staggering amount of war debt that was just crippling the new United States. We're talking about a mountain of IOUs to foreign countries, to the states, even to its own citizens. And there was absolutely no credible way to pay any of it back. The country's financial reputation, it was totally in the gutter.
Okay, so this wasn't just some number on a spreadsheet, right? This debt crisis was a genuine existential threat. The whole idea of the United States could have failed before it even really got started. So let's really get into just how bad things were.
Think about it. The currency was worthless. There was this deep, deep distrust between the states. Each one was pretty much acting like its own little country. And the national government? Totally powerless. The nation was crying out for a financial architect, and boy, did it find one. Enter the first Secretary of the Treasury, the ambitious and frankly brilliant Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton wasn't just thinking about paying off the debt. No. He had a vision. He saw a future America that was powerful, modern, an industrial giant. And he had this huge, comprehensive blueprint to make it all happen. A blueprint that was, let's just say, deeply controversial. So how was he going to fund this whole grand plan? Well, the main source of cash was going to be tariffs, taxes on imported goods. But there's a problem, right? How do you actually collect those taxes? You've got to enforce the law. So Hamilton makes this move that has these huge, long-lasting consequences. He creates an armed service just for that job. They called it the Revenue Cutter Service, and yep, it's the direct forerunner of today's U.S. Coast Guard.
Okay, so his whole plan, which he laid out in these famous reports, basically rested on four giant pillars. First up, public credit. The idea here was for the federal government to take on all the individual state debts. This was huge. It would show the world that the U.S. pays its bills. Second, a national bank, kind of like the Bank of England, to manage the country's money and create one stable currency. Third, a U.S. mint, to finally get rid of that crazy mix of state and foreign coins everyone was using. And fourth, he wanted to promote manufacturing with tariffs. The goal? To build a really strong economy right here at home. It was basically the whole shebang, a complete blueprint for a prosperous nation. But you can probably guess, not everyone was on board with this vision of a powerful, centralized economy that looked a lot like Great Britain's. In fact, it didn't just cause a little disagreement. It ignited a fierce, ideological battle for the very soul of the new nation. And right at the heart of this fight were two of Washington's closest advisors, two absolute titans of the era. In one corner, you have Hamilton, dreaming of a bustling nation of commerce and industry, all driven by a strong federal government. And in the other corner, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. He had a totally different dream, an agrarian republic, a nation of small, independent farmers. And he was terrified that a strong central government would just turn into the monarchy they'd just escaped.
The whole debate really came to a head over the idea of a national bank. Jefferson's argument was simple. The Constitution doesn't say you can create a bank, so you can't. It's unconstitutional. Full stop. But Hamilton, he fires back with this brilliant legal argument, the doctrine of implied powers. He basically said, look, the Constitution gives the government the power to do whatever is necessary and proper to get its job done. It was a game changer.
So who would Washington side with? In the end, the president went with Hamilton. And that single decision set this incredible precedent for broad federal power that honestly still shapes our government today. It was a massive win for Hamilton's vision, but it also hardened the opposition. And this fundamental disagreement, well, it literally gave birth to America's first political parties. You had Hamilton's Federalists on one side and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans on the other. This battle of ideas in the Capitol didn't stay there for long. It was about to explode into open rebellion out on the frontier. And the spark that lit the fuse? One tiny but crucial part of Hamilton's funding plan: a tax on whiskey. And man,
This chart just perfectly shows the economic divide in the country. Hamilton's tax was what we'd call regressive. It was a flat tax, the same amount per gallon no matter what. So what did that mean? Well, it could nearly double the price of the cheap homemade whiskey out on the frontier, but it barely made a dent in the price of the fancy, expensive stuff sold in the wealthy cities back east.
See, for these frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't some luxury drink. It was everything. It was just so hard to lug heavy grain over the mountains, so they distilled it into whiskey. It was easier to ship, easier to trade. For them, whiskey was money. So taxing their whiskey, it was like taxing their paycheck. They felt like the federal government was just stealing from the poor to pay interest to rich bondholders in the cities. And here's a really crucial point. These farmers weren't just anti-tax anarchists. Their rallying cry was equal taxation and no excise. An excise tax is just a tax on something made and sold at home. They felt this tax was deeply unfair. What they wanted was a system that was proportionate to how much wealth you had, not one that hammered the one and only product they could sell to survive.
Things escalated fast. Resistance went from protests to straight-up violence. Rebels were shutting down courts, they were tarring and feathering tax collectors, and at its peak, you had an army of nearly 8,000 guys gathering near Pittsburgh. So, how did the government respond? President Washington did something no one had ever seen before. He personally got on his horse and led a federal army of 12,000 troops to put down the rebellion. It was this massive show of force, proving the new government had the power and, more importantly, the will to enforce its own laws.
So, the rebellion was put down, and pretty much without a major battle. But the impact of this, and of Hamilton's entire financial system, it would send ripples through all of American history. The nation was, at this point, permanently changed. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, it's kind of two-sided, right? On one hand, Hamilton's plan was, without a doubt, a huge success. It established America's credit, it brought in foreign investment, and it proved the federal government was for real. But on the other hand, the intense conflicts it sparked, they created our two-party political system and kicked off this debate that we're still having about economic fairness and just how much power the federal government should have.
And really, that's what it all comes down to. This central question that was born from Hamilton's blueprint and the rebellion against it: what is the right balance between a strong national economy and individual liberty? That's not just some dusty old question from a history book. It's a debate that is still very much alive, and it continues to define American politics to this very day.